Welcome to this edition of MDM's Quicktake. I'm Tom Gale. My guest today is Indian River Consulting Group's founding partner, Mike Marks. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. This is almost like a regular routine we got, like a radio show. What do you want to talk about, Tom?
We spend a lot of time talking about the many different angles of the massive industry transitions that's taking place in distribution and the transformation around sales and business models. And today I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that larger business model transformation. We were just talking about a presentation you did earlier this week where you focused on what the transition is looking like in the industry from a Gen 1 to a Gen 2 distributor.
Yep.
And I'd like to get your thoughts about what that looks like. What do you mean when you talk about that?
The Gen 1, if you think about it, most of the distributors in the U.S., and I'm going to quote some of the analytic data that you guys share and publish, but most distributors in the U.S. started right after World War II. People came back, didn't have jobs. So the guy at Gordon Foods started to sell eggs door to door from his neighbors, got more eggs, and now it's, $12 billion or something. But what happened, the only option at the time, if you think about the supply chain after World War II, manufacturers had an issue trying to get product closer to point of consumption because there wasn't reliable logistics, right? Everything was, they didn't even have faxes then. You got to go back and remember, if you want to do something, you mail the letter, right? So distributors bought product because they got to make high margin because they tied up their capital and inventory. Manufacturers are happy to get it to point of consumption. The only way a customer can learn anything new would be to talk to a field salesperson or read a Sears catalog. And there were very, very limited options. So having a good sales guy could bring you up into new products and all this stuff. Manufacturers didn't want to deal with credit as small customers, and distributors took that on. So they combined capital, energy, labor, and materials, and they provided a service. Well, so when you start talking about Gen 2, you start thinking about unbundling. In a perfect example, Uber is the biggest transportation company. They don't own any vehicles other than a couple of Waymos. Think about Airbnb, right? Largest realtor. They don't own any real estate. People just said, I don't need the car. I just need to borrow one for a while. Let me create a mechanism. And that wouldn't have worked without digital. So now manufacturers say, I can go to a manufacturer's rep and pay them, just making up a number of Gen 2. I can pay them a 5% commission, or I got to pay a distributor 20. Well, if I'm doing all this other work, why do I need to pay him 20? Why don't I get a guy to do 5? Because a manufacturer today if I've got a good IMR network, if I got a 3PL warehouse, it doesn't take title of the inventory, but does the logistics for me. That's what Nike's done with 3PL systems. They can deliver a pair of shoes to a retailer next day anywhere around UPS, as long as I know by 4:00. And so if I have a 3PL and if I outsource my receivables to MasterCharge or Visa or Amex, and all three have giant sales departments trying to take over receivables, then all of a sudden, why do I need to have a distributor, right? If somebody else is managing, I use my IMR. So what's happened, distribution's unbundling, and distributors need so much money to cover the cost of the working capital they in, because they need typically 25 to 30 cents for every dollar of growth they have of extra capital they got to put in the business. So now all of a sudden, none of this work without digital. Gen 2, remember, inventory works like a capacitor in an electrical circuit. It stores up energy and then releases it. And inventory is a substitute for poor demand information. If I know what somebody's going to need on Tuesday, I can order it, have it delivered to my branch on Monday, or even drop ship. And so because I didn't have the information, I had all this inventory, which says I have all this working capital. And so now there's still stupid, idiot manufacturers. And a lot of these are big public companies. And I just want to say that because I feel strongly about it, that are idiots, and they don't want anybody to have live access to their finished goods inventory. My competitors might say it. And so distributors are much further ahead than manufacturers. If I could get visibility on that, we do enterprise consulting. We had 2 big manufacturers that wanted to get rid of a distributor, said, could we self-distribute? And so they gave us all their information. We kept it separate. So if it didn't happen, nobody learned about the other guys. They decided they couldn't eliminate the distributor. They were all whiny about it because they didn't understand what a distributor did. So we put all this stuff together, and if the manufacturers let the distributor have that information, we wouldn't have faxes, we wouldn't have phone calls. We could do what Square D does and let people get special pricing authorizations online without a bunch of mother may I stuff. And when you take all this out, all of a sudden the distributor is going to be having 20 capital turns instead of 3 or 4, right? And they need a lot less margin to cover that and still make a good return. So what happens is that the companies, and this is when last time we talked about the gap between the leaders and the followers, it's getting bigger and bigger. Those that are moving to that Gen 2 and figuring out how do I build an asset-light business, how do I bring digital into these processes, are going to be able to sell a lot lower in the market than their competitors in the Gen 1, and they're going to make more money. Sorry, as a consultant, that's the shortest answer I have.
I can always tell how passionate you are about a topic, but how fast you talk. So I've been trying to keep up with you. I want to dive more into the characteristics and description of what Gen 2 looks like. This has been a number of cycles here. We all talk about digital, and it's kind of like what the latest thing is, and the biggest threat, the biggest impact. And of course, it's Chat GPT and AI is it right now. But let's go back mid-90s. Grainger develops the first CD-ROM, but then shortly after that, the internet really exploded. We got into the dot-com era, and it's kind of been one iteration. And then the early 2010s, that's really when Amazon started to kick in. And after that, what we've really seen, I think, in this last 5 years, the digital aspect has really started to mature, to blossom in a lot of ways in terms of a lot more maturity and alternate channels. The different market channels that have emerged in terms of marketplace, direct to consumer, manufacturer direct. I think that's an important context in terms of where distributors keep hold of what their core DNA is as far as the differentiation against all of this and what it really looks like in terms of developing a Gen 2 strategy.
You went right to the heart of it, because the main difference is that a Gen 1 distributor, long-range planning is what they do after lunch. Distributors survive by reacting quickly to threats and opportunities. So I'm not going to go add 2 more inside salespeople because my sales plan says it's going to be big. I'll wait till my inside salespeople are screaming and yelling and about to quit, then I'll put another body in. The difference, somebody's on a Gen 2, wherever they are in that journey, they've made a decision that the Gen 1 guys haven't. The Gen 1 guys are looking for an event that I can go do something. I'm going to go buy a CRM and the world's going to be wonderful. But the Gen 2 people say, I'm going on a journey. And the company you mentioned, Grainger, is a perfect example. They did the CD-ROM, then they did the son of CD-ROM, and then the internet. And Grainger continues to innovate. And what they did, that's a perfect example. And a small distributor can do this because the cost of technology has collapsed. It's dirt cheap now compared to what it was. But Grainger continually innovated, and they learned from what they did. They didn't punish it. Lifestyle and the Gen 1 distributors, basically, if their little experiment didn't work, it meant it was a bad guy or gal, and shoot him, do something else. But Grainger kept learning and learning and learning. And then at the NIW Executive Conference this year, when you and I were there, the McKinsey people came in and got permission from Grainger to talk about the journey. Grainger brought in McKinsey for multiple years, did a bunch of serious things, but it's a journey. Grainger leadership said, we're on a journey to be the best solution for our customers. And now over 50% of their business is e-com. And they also formed Zorro without being hostage to the past. And so, but the key thing is not what Grainger did. It's the leadership that says, we're going to go on a journey, and what we're doing is not okay. We always want to look for the next thing and start investing money. And they actually invest money like a manufacturer does. If you think about manufacturers have R&D budgets that, let's say 4% of revenue goes into research and development. Grainger has a budget for this continual innovation. So when you start looking at that, the thing that's significant, everybody talks about the results. They don't see the journey and the leadership that's involved, but a $15 million distributor can be fully digital today, right? You shoot one old school sales guy that's got a route mentality, and that enough money to actually over a couple of years will get you there. But people get stuck and they don't know how to go.
Yeah.
Sorry, you got me all jazzed up there.
Yeah, I think you were even talking faster. The thread that I want to just stay on there, but because it really was a great example, is Grainger started by examining what their go-to-market strategy was. Then they recognized that they were not doing a good job of capturing that smaller customer market. They were doing a good job at the mid and larger enterprise, right. And they had all the infrastructure and pieces in place to capture that. Over the last 10 years, how many of the largest distributors have been shedding branches and transforming what that business model looks like, more digitally forward strategy
but more aligned with how their customers wanted to buy. Every one of those steps got them closer, and the customers liked it more. There's a better customer journey. I mean, the work that you guys have done, Fastenal is closed. How many branches? since they decided to go on their digital journey. And look at what's happened to their PE and their revenue and their growth rate. I mean, they're kicking butt. The idea that there's going to be a process, an ongoing effort, we're going to change, the sales force is involved. It's just taking the steps and going through it. And to me, if you think about what we did at Shift last year, you know, you had Gartner sharing research that said, what was it? 72% of buyers prefer a rep-free experience. And if you go back to the beginning, if you go back to the very beginning, salesperson was the only way a customer could find out what's new. There are digital tools now. And so there's only 17% of the time they spend, and you got to share that with competitors. 72% rep-free. The world started off being field sales centric. It has changed, but industrial distributors typically are still thinking it's the same because the sales guys are still out there buying. If the customer's only buying on price and delivery, why do you need a salesperson? All they need to do, that's the FedEx model. And that's Peter Drucker saying that marketing is a core function. If I do a good job of marketing, I don't need any selling because all I have to do is make the customer aware of the solution that I have. Think about FedEx. FedEx was built on a marketing model. They just had to make sure people knew how to get a hold of them. And they don't need salespeople. They've got a couple now, but I mean, that's a different discussion. But we're still hostage to history. And ask the distributor needs to ask themselves the question, if all my salespeople quit tomorrow, am I going to rehire the same thing? Or if I got an opportunity to do something different, you know they're all going to do something different, but we're duct taped to the wall. In the old days, Grainger got coverage with a catalog, and they're figuring to take it out. The same thing, I have an Allied Electronics catalog, right? Which is a museum piece, which is even thicker than a Grainger catalog. And that's probably one of the most fully digital distributors that exists in the US today.
Every distribution company has some degree of Gen 1 that's still part of their core day-to-day DNA.
Exactly.
Then my question to you is, how does a distributor move from that Gen 1 mindset to create a new go-to-market strategy to get to a Gen 2?
Step one is decide that you're going to go on a journey that's multiple years and not just solve a problem. That's the very first decision. The second decision is surround yourself, step into that flow of information and the companies that are doing it and be a fast follower. You don't have to invent everything in a vacuum, but you can go take a look at what have these other people done. And I can take an idea from a plastics distributor, industrial distributor, piping distributor. Personally, I think they all go to the NBN Shift conference, but I mean, that's a little self-serving, but there's tons of newsletters and things out there that people need to get their leadership team, not just the sales guy. They need to get their whole leadership team looking at all this thing and what other people are doing.
Great place to wrap things up, Mike. As always, thanks. Have a great week.
You too, sir.